I think at this point it's safe to say that the Zelda fanbase is in a rocky position right now. When Breath of the Wild first released, it was hard to find anyone who dared to criticize it. The few people who did were endlessly harassed online over it. There were plenty of people who didn't care for this new style at the time, myself included, but it was hard to get a word in over the oceans of journalists, newcomers, and a decent portion of older fans who couldn't contain their endless praise over it. As much as I dislike Breath of the Wild, I'm not here to argue over its quality or if it succeeds at being a Zelda game, but it's important to point out that there's always been criticism over Zelda's drastic departure from the norm this generation. Fast forward a long 6 years, and we finally got the sequel that the Zelda team had been dangling over our heads. This time the reception wasn't nearly as unanimous. While Tears of the Kingdom had outstanding reviews and a similar amount of praise from fans at launch, the criticism was notably more intense. It didn't even take a year for the popular opinion to sour on it, with more and more people coming out of the woodwork to voice their discontent, even people who loved Breath of the Wild. Those who dislike the new style hate Tears of the Kingdom because it doubled down on all the things they hated about Breath of the Wild, while those who love the new style hate Tears of the Kingdom because it didn't do a good job evolving the things they loved about Breath of the Wild. That's not to say that there aren't still people who love this game, but there were also plenty of people who loved Skyward Sword when it was the new kid on the block, a game that's commonly thought of as the breaking point for fans over the old style of Zelda. Regardless of the reason, there is a large section of the fanbase who are discontent with the current state of the franchise. The next game needed to do something to win those people back over, and the general consensus seems to be that bringing back a few classic elements to streamline the new style while satisfying those who preferred the old style is the way to go. Nintendo seems to have a very surface-level understanding of this because a little over a year later they released a game that seems to address some of the minor complaints with the new style while also reiterating that it's here to stay. Mechanically, the biggest gimmick in Echoes of Wisdom is the Echo ability, where you can make copies of different objects and abilities that you've learnt over the course of the game. The game is notably loose about what will and won't work for each obstacle, allowing for the player to solve the puzzle however they want. It's a very similar approach as Tears of the Kingdom, and like Tears of the Kingdom, all it accomplishes is turning a mechanic that sounded decent on paper into one that simply doesn't work in practice. The level design in this game is intensely boring. As I'm typing the script, I struggle to remember a single puzzle involving this ability where the easiest and most obvious solution wasn't to simply stack beds or clouds on top of one another, and it only gets easier the further along into the game you go, as the more you progress, the more powerful the companion who lets you do these things gets. The few limitations you do have mean close to nothing when the developers are never allowed to design around them. This is a problem that has its roots in Breath of the Wild, though Tears of the Kingdom is when it really started to get bad. It is toned down quite a bit here by virtue of the fact that you can't do the same thing in a 2D game, but it somehow manages to be even less interesting in spite of that. At least Ultra Hand allowed the player to build crazy contraptions to their heart's content. It had no effect on the game itself and was largely a throwaway gimmick, but it still made for mountains of low-effort, clickbait brainrot content, so it benefited somebody, I guess. The Echo gimmick doesn't even manage that. None of the things you can summon interact with one another in any special way. It doesn't feel like they tried something new here, it just feels like they did what Tears of the Kingdom did, but now in 2D, and somehow even worse. Your only other major ability involves using your companion to lock the position of an object relative to you, and it's also quite underwhelming. There are plenty of times when you're forced to use it, but not nearly in interesting enough ways. You can also do the opposite and lock yourself relative to a moving object, and it's used literally once when they introduce the mechanic and never again. This kind of ability would have been relegated to a dungeon item in one of the classic games. In fact, the Magnetic Gloves in Oracle of Seasons had a very similar concept, but in that game it was one of many different key items that you would use intermittently throughout the game. In this game it's one of your only two abilities, and it's obtained within the first hour. An entire game's worth of puzzles has to rely on these two things, and neither of them are nearly interesting enough to do the job. I don't even really think they tried half the time. I couldn't tell you the sheer amount of times I heard the puzzle solve jingle and thought to myself, that was considered a puzzle? Once again, this is another issue that the game shares with Tears of the Kingdom. The puzzle design has a major negative impact on the dungeons. In a move that brought me hope when I first saw demos of the game, the Zelda team brought back a dungeon structure that was at least comparable to the classic-style dungeons. The activate 5 waypoints to beat the dungeon structure is no more, at least within the dungeons themselves. The water dungeon is the only one that even comes close to being similar, and even then it's segmented in a way that negates most of the issues with that style. Locked doors and keys are back, including special ones for the boss room. There's even an order that you have to do the dungeons in, though it's more similar to the way A Link Between Worlds handles it than any of the other games. These are all things that I and many others were begging to come back, so I'm happy that they're at least here, but the dungeons themselves are not good. With no key items tied to the dungeons, they struggle to have much of a mechanical theme or identity. Outside of one of the later dungeons, they never feel like they revolve around and build upon a core concept. There's rarely a point where a puzzle you solved earlier is expanded upon later in the dungeon, or a new mechanic is utilized in multiple interesting ways. A Link Between Worlds also struggled with this, but at the very least it had the occasional decent puzzle to make things less boring. Even the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild all had a unique mechanic introduced where you were required to manipulate them in different ways, all of which had wildly different implications from each other. You had to tilt Va Meadow so gravity could shift different elements around. You had to rotate the different sections of Va Naboris around you so you could complete different electrical circuits. You know that the dungeons are bad when I'm comparing them unfavorably to the Divine Beasts. The only dungeon that I walked away from feeling even partially satisfied was the generic ice dungeon whose name I didn't care to remember, which is a similar feeling to the Lightning Temple in Tears of the Kingdom. It's the one halfway decent gem of a dungeon that requires digging through mountains upon mountains of crap to get to. The rest of the dungeons in this game are painfully monotonous in ways that approach the very original Legend of Zelda, but at least in that game the dungeons still manage to be fun and challenging due to how interesting the combat is. Echoes of Wisdom can't even manage that. Unlike every other game in the series, a sword is not your main method of combat. Instead, the Echoes gimmick rears its ugly head again and wedges its way into places it shouldn't. Combat in this game primarily consists of sitting in a corner and occasionally moving a few inches to dodge an oncoming projectile while your Echoes do all the work for you. Trying to take a more active role in combat will invariably get you killed, since you are notably frail in this game. This passive playstyle is made even more effective by the fact that Echoes of Wisdom has basically the same food mechanics from the previous two games, but with a new coat of paint. It has the same issues as those games too, but here it's made redundant by the fact that Zelda can sleep in the bed Echo to regain health at any time. It's not too overpowered in the first half of the game, but once you reach the plot twist you're given access to Zelda's bed, which heals an entire 2 hearts every few seconds. Enemies tend to target your monster Echoes before they target you, which means that in nearly every fight in the second half of the game you have more than enough time to regain full health while the boss is busy dealing with the Lizalfos. It slows down an already long and tedious combat system to a crawl, and you don't want to avoid doing this because, as I said earlier, you're incredibly frail in this game. If all of this sounds boring, that's because it is. It doesn't help that the targeting system is the most imprecise and worst feeling one in the series to date. This kind of thing was and still is a necessity in the 3D games, and the only reason why it seems to be here is because the movement is in 360 degrees like in A Link Between Worlds. After replaying that game for a different video, I don't think 360 degree movement works in a 2D Zelda, at least not one that uses stick controls. Even if every other opinion in this video manages to be completely outspoken, I have a hunch that the combat in general is going to be the single most criticized and agreed upon aspect of this game. There is a sword ability, but it's a transformation that drains an energy meter. It drains deceptively fast too, and the only way to regain energy is to either drink this game's replacement for potions or find it in this game's replacement of the Dark World. You can upgrade the meter fairly early on, but it's still enough of a limitation that I feel like I'm doing something wrong every time I use it outside of a boss fight. The entire system is unsatisfying, and I wish they would just let me keep the sword permanently equipped and found a different way of incentivizing Echoes in combat, possibly by making them actually fun and rewarding. But then they wouldn't have a reason to justify not letting me play as Link in his own damn game. I've been saving this discussion until now because I didn't want to seem like I only made this video to combat the woke mob or whatever. I'm not denying that people like that exist, but I've seen more people making fun of those people online than I've seen of those people. Even in Reddit threads and YouTube comments, it's not uncommon to see people talk about how conservatives are up in arms over playing as a girl in the new Zelda. It's getting dangerously close to the "if you don't like this, then you're a bigot" arguments that have been plaguing corporate media these past few years. I think there's a discussion to be had about the topic that doesn't revolve around the concept of sexism, and I only bring this up because I know there are going to be at least a few people in the comments that try to tell me that the only reason why I don't like this game is because I hate women. To those people, you're not making me look bad, you're just making yourself look like an ass. The game's biggest selling point is the fact that for the first time ever, Zelda is the protagonist and, outside of the intro, the sole playable character. This was obviously the main selling point, as they put the biggest emphasis on it in the initial trailer.
Things like water blocks. How you use them separately or together is entirely up to you.
Needless to say, I was not impressed. Playable Zelda has been a talking point for the series for a while now, and when the initial trailer for Tears of the Kingdom made it seem like the princess would take a more active role in the story, it caused fans to speculate that she would be playable. There was a noticeable outcry when the next trailer made it clear that she was in fact not a playable character. Something to note about the disappointment over Zelda not being playable is that it was always about her being playable in addition to Link. Very few people were legitimately arguing that they wanted Zelda to hold the spotlight instead of Link, and it's pretty obvious why. We like playing as Link. He's the hero. He's the icon of the series. he's a character that exists to be a player insert. I was never against playing as Zelda, but it was always with the expectation that I was still going to be able to play as Link too. Echoes of Wisdom does not do that. Link is playable in the tutorial, but that's the only part where he's playable. It's like they're dangling what could have been in front of you only to rip it away. I could have at least forgiven this as long as they did something interesting with the concept, though. Maybe there was a good reason why Link couldn't be playable in this one. Then the plot twist happened. Zelda defeats an Echo of Ganon. Then the game's main villain attacks her. Out of nowhere, Link jumps in and saves her, only to immediately get captured in the same crystal that Zelda was in at the very beginning of the game. Out of every single aspect of this game, this was the one thing that I still hoped and prayed would not happen every day up until I played it. I knew I wasn't going to like the Echo's gimmick. I knew I wasn't going to like the combat. I basically knew that I wasn't going to enjoy this entire game going into it. I still hope that they would have at least done something better with the concept of Zelda as the protagonist than this. This is the exact same dynamic that these two characters have had for nearly 4 decades, just with the faces swapped. What's the point of making Zelda the main character if all you're going to do is have Link serve the same purpose Zelda usually does? It's one thing when Link rescues Zelda because they never pretend that they're trying to upend the status quo of their relationship by doing it. But in this game, upending the status quo is the entire point, and yet it fails at even doing that. On top of that, being forced to rescue Link feels incredibly shitty for the same reasons why I never wanted him to stop being playable in the first place. I don't like being forced to rescue the self-insert character. These are all completely personal reasons though, and I don't expect to change anyone's minds by saying this, but I know that at the very least I'm not alone in this sentiment. Forcing the player to play as Zelda while Link is robbed of his own agency just alienates a large portion of the fanbase, and for what? It's not like there's any reason why Link couldn't be playable. You're already giving Zelda the ability to transform into a Link clone. At that point, just ditch the energy meter and let me swap to Link whenever I want. I know that this isn't the case, but it feels like Zelda being the main character was the idea that they started with, and the rest of the game was haphazardly built around that. In reality, Aonuma had been wanting to make Zelda the main character for a while, and was simply waiting for the right gimmick to come along to justify her inclusion. That just makes me wonder why he couldn't make a game where we play as Sheik. That's already one of her more iconic roles in the series, and giving her a ninja-like fighting style would have differentiated her from Link without the need for an overly gimmicky and tedious spawning mechanic. On top of that, the concept of a game that takes place immediately after Ocarina of Time gives the Zelda team a reason for Link to not be playable that doesn't resort to making him a damsel in distress replacement. Link is in another timeline entirely, and it's Zelda's fault, so she has to take the reins and save her kingdom. There. I just came up with an idea that achieves everything the Zelda team was attempting with Echoes of Wisdom without the drawbacks of their method. I definitely would have preferred if I could play as Link, but I wouldn't be nearly as annoyed with the end product if this is what we got. Instead, we get a game where nearly every problem feels like the direct result of the need to have Zelda take the spotlight. The final boss is the perfect showcase of this. Zelda rescues Link, and they both face off against it together. It sounds like a decent idea until you realize that it's already been done before in Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, and Spirit Tracks, and Tears of the Kingdom. In all of these games, Link gets to do the fun part while Zelda provides a mere supporting role, and the only difference in this fight is that you're forced to be in Zelda's position this time. You can't even use the sword anymore. You're exclusively using the boring gimmick mechanics now. After an entire game of wishing I could just play as Link, this was the cherry on top of heartbreak and disappointment. I was always neutral on the idea of Zelda being a playable character, but if this is the kind of effort the Zelda team is willing to put in, I sincerely hope that it's a one-and-done gimmick. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to matter what fans like me think. Like I said at the beginning, the fanbase is in a rocky position right now. While there are plenty of people who are happy with the current state of the franchise, there's an equally loud portion of the fanbase who wishes we could just return to the formula that made us fall in love with the series to begin with, myself included. Fortunately, Echoes of Wisdom does make an effort to restore a few classic elements, but they all miss the mark by quite a bit. I've already mentioned how the dungeons lack much in the way of focus, and the dungeon order doesn't really mean much of anything when they're never really allowed to build off of one another. Bottles make a return, but they're only used for fairies and are made completely redundant by the aforementioned smoothie and bed mechanics. The reason why bottles are such a good mechanic in the classic games is because they limited your healing capability so you couldn't just brute force your way through each fight, while also giving you the option to upgrade that healing ability through exploration. In this game, healing is such a non-issue that I never went out of my way to obtain a second bottle, or even refill the one I had after I used the fairy it gives you in the tutorial. The same could be said for all the other side content, including the also returning heart pieces. After I obtained enough to complete a single full container, I actively avoided picking up any more, even the ones that were right in front of me. I simply couldn't be bothered to use the tedious game mechanics to pick any more up. There was no benefit. Even in Tears of the Kingdom, I still completed any shrine that I happened to walk past because extra stamina and health are legitimately useful things to have. That's not to say that there weren't boss fights in this game that I died to, but in nearly every case I only died because I grew impatient and tried to kill an enemy manually. For similar reasons, I didn't bother with nearly any of the side content in the game. I saw Dampe introduce himself as a mechanic or whatever and simply walked past him. I never would have even known that a horse or different outfits existed in this game had I not watched the trailers. I obtained exactly 3 accessories throughout the entire game, and the only one I ever used for any extended period of time just made traversal even more pathetic. Outside of the one smoothie that's required to beat the game, and the one other smoothie that I made just because I was already there, I never touched the mechanic. This was also the only time in the entire game I spent a single rupee. The only other major side quest that I bothered even trying was the stamp side quest, and only because a similar stamp side quest is in Spirit Tracks, a game that I actually like. I filled out the first card and my reward was just more ingredients for smoothies. I stopped bothering after that. You might hear me say all of this and think that it's unreasonable for me to complain about the side content when I didn't even bother attempting it, but it's not my fault that I felt no incentive to explore anything beyond the required sections of the game. At no point in the game did I ever feel like it was beneficial for me to go ride a horse anywhere, or gather more ingredients for smoothies, or use whatever the hell Dampe's Tinker Toys were for. None of this is even mentioning the other less than favorable parts of the game. The art style is ripped straight from the Link's Awakening remake, and I hate it. Don't get me wrong, it was wonderful in Link's Awakening, but that's because it was purpose-built for that game. Link's Awakening has always had a bit of a surrealist tone and atmosphere to it, so the toy-like diorama art style fits with its dreamlike story incredibly well. That aesthetic is nowhere to be found in Echoes of Wisdom. Not only does it feel completely out of place here, but it ultimately devalues how special the art style felt in Link's Awakening too. If they really wanted to reuse this art style, they should have just remade the Oracle games, or better yet, the Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls. At least those games already used a similar art style as the original Link's Awakening with the same basic code. Reusing the art style here just feels like they couldn't be bothered to come up with anything better. Look, I don't like being negative about modern Zelda. I want nothing more than for the series to be good, and it pains me to talk about each new entry when it releases only to have nothing but negativity over it. I ended up getting sick of Echoes of Wisdom before I even got to the 3rd dungeon. Before Tears of the Kingdom, that was a sensation that I thought was impossible for me to feel playing a Zelda. I didn't even feel that way about Breath of the Wild. In a little over a year, I've been burned by not one but 2 different games in a series that I otherwise had nothing but the utmost respect and adoration for. For what it's worth, I do think that Echoes of Wisdom is a better game than Tears of the Kingdom, but that's not exactly high praise, and the only reason why I feel that way is because it's shorter and its story didn't insult my intelligence to nearly the same extent. Both games are still at the very bottom tier of the franchise, and I'm afraid that in just a few years' time they won't be. At the very least, I do appreciate the attempt at bringing back some of the elements from the classic games, even if they're all butchered in some way, but these were only baby steps in the right direction, and Echoes of Wisdom is not the return to form that the series desperately needs right now. I don't think they wanted it to be that return to form either. Aonuma has made it clear that this new style of being as unrestrictive as possible is here to stay. I've implied this earlier, but I think that most of the shortcomings from the Switch Zeldas have been a direct result of Aonuma's insistence on throwing out any semblance of consistency and reinventing the wheel with each new entry. I'm not saying that changes shouldn't have been made, but they needed to be a lot more delicate and subtle than what's been done. Why would he stop doing that, though? Regardless of quality, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have been the best-selling games in the series by a wide margin. My only hope is that Echoes of Wisdom will be seen as a breaking point for this new style of Zelda and will turn away people who already didn't care for Tears of the Kingdom. Even if that is the case, though, it's still going to be bought by millions of people. I have a confession. I'm not one of those millions. I didn't buy the game. I lent the game from a friend who happened to get a copy a few days before it was officially released. I didn't even really want to play it. I wasn't even planning on making a video until after I started. Like I said before, the only thing I had hope for in this game was that the Link situation would potentially not suck, and rather than wait a few days to watch a playthrough, I decided I would just rip the band-aid off and find out for myself. This is the first time I've ever resorted to this kind of thing, at least for a new game. It's not something that I ever plan on making a habit of, but I figured since I wasn't going to be buying the game anyway, nothing was lost. I don't like resorting to this, but I fully believe that the way that the franchise has been handled this past decade has been unfortunate at best and insulting at worst. Tears of the Kingdom burned me for $70, and they needed to win my trust back before I started blindly purchasing each new game again. It's safe to say that they have not. Whenever I voice my opinion on the series, I'm always met with accusations, as if I'm demanding that the series, quote, does the same thing over and over again, end quote. I'm not, and I guarantee you that there's nobody on planet Earth who wants that for the series either, but there's a difference between evolution and replacement. It's not unreasonable to want the series to do something new, but it's equally reasonable to not want the series to throw away its defining attributes in order to obtain that newness. It's not impossible to utilize a formula to do new and exciting things. Ocarina of Time is proof of this, a game that largely copies most of its structure and mechanics from its predecessors and yet is still considered one of the most groundbreaking and revolutionary games of all time. We didn't need to throw away the past and never look back in order to make the series feel new and fresh. On the contrary, it was nice to have a shared mechanical theme throughout the series, something that each game could use as a launching point to explore new and exciting ideas from. If I wanted something that didn't follow the formula, I could always just play a different game. Zelda would always be there for when I wanted something exciting yet familiar. Once Breath of the Wild released, the only thread that seemed to connect all these games together was the fact that you play as Link and swing a sword to kill bad guys. Now we don't even have that.